On Christmas Day 1069, William the Conqueror held court in a city of cinders. York had been fought over twice that year, and the second battle had left it a burned-out shell, with the minster gutted along with almost everything else. And yet William reportedly had his crown and royal regalia brought up from the south, so he could wear them there, in the wreckage. The performance had a point. He was telling the north of England that he was its king, whether it wanted him or not. But that ceremony was also a hinge between two campaigns, and behind him lay a year of rebellion that had nearly cost him his new kingdom. Ahead of him lay the order he was about to give, that his soldiers should fan out across Yorkshire and destroy everything a human being needs to survive a winter. That meant the food, the seeds, the plows, the cattle, and often the entire villages themselves. A chronicler born just a few years after these events claimed that more than 100,000 people perished of hunger in the months that followed. Even writers who admired William treated it as the darkest mark on his record. We remember it as the harrying of the North, and it has a fair claim to being the cruelest thing any king of England has ever done to his own subjects. England in 1066 was one united kingdom mostly on paper, a newly conquered territory still being brought into the Norman fold. The North, meaning roughly Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland, was a different world from the South. Generations of Viking settlement had produced an Anglo-Scandinavian society with its own customs and dialect, and an aristocracy south of the Tees that was partly Danish in origin. The roads were so poor that travelers between York and the south often found it easier to go by ship, and the region had a long habit and history of something between high autonomy and full self-rule. Back in 962, King Edgar had effectively traded legal autonomy to the northern earls for their loyalty. This meant the kings who followed governed beyond the Humber, more in theory than in practice, with only loose allegiances in the north. After Hastings, English resistance gathered around Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandson of Edmund Ironside and the last royal claimant of the House of Wessex. He submitted to William at Berkhamsted in December 1066, along with most of the surviving English leadership, but the submission didn't hold. Of all the men who knelt to William that winter, the Archbishop of York was about the only one who stayed loyal. William's first instinct was to rule the north through proxies, and the results were almost comically bad. He made a Northumbrian named Copsey the Earl of the area in 1067, with hopes that putting a local in charge would help calm dissent in the region. Copsey lasted all of 5 weeks before a rival named Osulf cut him down. Osulf, for his part, seized the earldom and attempted to rule the region on behalf of William, but he perished within the year himself. Then his cousin Gospatric simply bought the title from William, held it briefly, and joined Edgar Atheling's rebellion in 1068. 2 earls slain, and a third turned traitor, all in about 18 months, and with that, William marched north that summer, and the opposition melted away before him. Edgar and his allies fled to the court of Malcolm III, King of Scots, and waited for an opportunity to strike the Norman. So William changed tactics and appointed one of his own, a knight named Robert de Comines, as Earl of Northumbria. Robert headed north with somewhere between 500 and 900 men, depending on which source you read. Athelwine, the English Bishop of Durham, warned him that a rebel army was gathering and that he was riding into a trap. Robert ignored him and quartered his men in Durham anyway, where they reportedly treated the town like enemy territory. Before dawn on the 28th of January 1069, the Northumbrians broke through the gates and went through the town end to end, eliminating Robert's men in the streets and houses. The Earl himself took refuge in the bishop's residence, so the rebels simply burned it down over his head. Robert had been, in title, the Earl of Northumbria for as little as a few months, and he never effectively ruled the area. Out of the entire Norman force, the sources say only 1 or 2 survivors escaped to carry the news south. From there, the rebellion spread immediately, and the rebels turned on York, where they eliminated the guardian of the new castle along with many of his men, and put the garrison under siege. William came north fast, caught the besiegers outside the castle, and broke them. He built a second castle across the river, left trusted men in charge, and went south again, presumably hoping the matter was settled. Edgar Atheling had been busy. He'd appealed to Sweyn II of Denmark, a nephew of King Canute with his own respectable claim to the English throne. In the late summer of 1069, Sweyn answered, and a Danish fleet of somewhere between 240 and 300 ships arrived. It was commanded by the king's brother and 2 of his sons, worked its way up the east coast, raiding as it went, and turned into the Humber estuary. There it joined Edgar, Gospatric, and the other Northumbrian leaders, and together they marched on York. What followed was a disaster of the Normans' own making. The garrison, trying to clear ground around the 2 castles before the assault, set fire to the nearby houses. The fire escaped them, tore through the city for days, and consumed most of it, including the minster. When the Danes and the English stormed York in September, the castles fell anyway. The garrison was effectively wiped out, with some accounts putting the Norman dead in the thousands, with numerous high nobles worth ransoming captured. It was the worst defeat William ever suffered on English soil, and for a few weeks his hold on the kingdom looked shakier than at any point since Hastings. Risings flared up as far away as Devon, Shropshire, and Staffordshire, and the whole Norman conquest was wobbling. William responded by dealing with the Midlands first, before he then marched on York. At the crossing of the River Aire, his army was reportedly held up for 3 weeks by broken bridges and hostile forces on the far bank. By the time he reached the city, the rebel army had scattered rather than face him. Edgar had slipped back over the border to Scotland, and the Danes had withdrawn to their ships in the Humber. And here William did something coldly practical. He sent envoys to the Danish commander and cut a deal. According to the Worcester Chronicle, he secretly paid the Danes a large sum and gave them leave to forage along the coast through the winter. The one condition was that they sail home in the spring without a fight, and as was tradition, the Danes accepted the deal. That left only the people of the north, and for them there would be no negotiated settlement to their rebellion. What William did to the north that winter wasn't a series of battles or even a campaign in the normal sense of the word. The rebels wouldn't meet him in the field, so he set out to destroy the thing that kept them in the field, the countryside itself. His army laid waste to the land along his line of march from the Aire, and after that Christmas Court in the ruins, he split his forces into smaller detachments. From there, he sent them out across Yorkshire with instructions that amounted to open conflict with anything that could sustain life. From the Humber to the Tees, the soldiers burned villages and slew the inhabitants who didn't flee. They torched grain stores and barns, smashed plows and farm tools, and slaughtered livestock where it stood. The detail that historians keep coming back to is the seed, because destroying it meant the survivors couldn't plant in spring. Whatever the first sweep of soldiers missed, hunger was meant to finish. It was siege warfare without a castle, as if the whole of Yorkshire had been declared a single fortress to be starved into surrender. Orderic Vitalis, the chronicler who gives us the fullest account, wrote that William made no attempt to restrain his fury and punish the innocent alongside the guilty. The land emptied, and refugees from the harrying turn up in the records as far south as Worcestershire. The Chronicle of Evesham Abbey describes starving people arriving at the abbey gates driven out of their northern homelands. Others fled north into lowland Scotland, many of whom ended up settling there permanently. The monks of Durham, with their bishop, took the body of St. Cuthbert, their most precious relic, and carried it out to the holy island of Lindisfarne for safekeeping. They were retracing the road their predecessors had walked 2 centuries earlier when they fled the Vikings. The North's holiest community was running from a Christian king, a fact that caused significant outrage across Western Europe. William, meanwhile, wasn't finished, and he intended to strike his enemies when they least expected it. In the depths of that winter, he took his army west across the Pennines, through terrain his own soldiers considered impassable in the season, to crush a rising at Chester. Orderic says some of his hired soldiers from Anjou, Brittany, and Maine begged to be released from service rather than attempt the crossing. He pressed on with the men who'd follow him, subdued Chester and Stafford, and devastated parts of Cheshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, and Shropshire on the way. Then came the spring, and the hunger, and the accounts that are hard to read even at 9.5 centuries distance. Simon of Durham, writing in the early 12th century, recorded that the famine grew so severe that people ate horses, dogs, and cats, amongst other even less desirable meals. He describes corpses rotting in houses and along roads, because no one was left with the strength to bury them. He claims the land between York and Durham lay uncultivated for 9 years afterwards, its empty villages the haunt of wild beasts and robbers. The Worcester Chronicle says William spent the entire winter laying waste to the country, slaying the inhabitants and inflicting every kind of evil without pause. The famous number of victims, often cited, comes from Orderic Vitalis, and the man himself is worth a moment so we can understand the context further. He was born in Shropshire in 1075, a few years after the harrying, to an English mother and a French father, and was sent at the age of 10 to a monastery in Normandy. He was a loyal subject of the Norman world, and his account praised William generously elsewhere. Yet on this subject, the harrying of the North, he refused any praise whatsoever. He wrote that more than 100,000 people perished of starvation, and stated flatly that God would punish the man who ordered it. The surprise here wasn't entirely that Orderic said it. It was the blunt confidence that God's punishment was coming for William for what he had done. We don't have to take the chronicler's word for it, because in 1086, William ordered the great survey of England we know as the Domesday Book. Domesday went village by village through Yorkshire. What its commissioners wrote over and over, estate after estate, was a single bleak Latin formula, meaning the land was waste. Modern analyses of the Yorkshire returns suggest 60% of holdings were wholly or partly wasteland 16 years after the harrying. It was found that 2/3 of villages contained manors that had been abandoned by their lords, and land values had collapsed. One great lord's Yorkshire estates, worth £260 in 1066, were valued at about £10 in 1086. The lands of one magnate fell from more than £550 to barely 90. It's important to remember that the value of these estates were tied to how many people could work the land and make it productive. The collapse in monetary value of the estate indirectly shows that a massive population drop must have accompanied it even decades later. By some calculations, only a quarter of the population and plow teams remained, and the bleakest readings of the evidence suggest most of the missing had either perished or never come back. Archaeology adds its own testimony, with hordes of coins buried around 1069 and never reclaimed. Notably, some villages across Yorkshire and Durham laid out afterwards are in suspiciously regular plans, as if they'd been built to a plan, rather than organically over generations. And yet, despite all of that, the harrying of the North is now one of the liveliest arguments in medieval English history, with some significantly downplaying the scale of the event. The skeptical case runs like this, and honestly, I'm presenting the best version of it here, even if I personally don't believe it. William was in the north for perhaps 3 months with an army of a few thousand men in midwinter. It's fair to ask whether that force could physically destroy thousands of square miles of countryside in the time available. The Danes were foraging along the coast that same winter, with William's blessing, and Scottish armies under Malcolm raided deep into the region soon afterwards. Under this theory, the Doomsday Book's portrait of extreme desolation may bundle together damage from several hands. Now here's where I consider this argument extremely weak. None of the other parties would have had their hands in the north but for William's harsh rule. Had he not already made a mess of the north, the other events wouldn't have happened. I feel like the causation here would have been foreseeable for William, so I don't think it's too remote to lay the blame at his feet for the actions of the Danes especially. In that instance, he specifically gave them the right to essentially raid the land as one of the terms for his settlement with them. Some scholars have even argued that waste or wasteland in the Doomsday Book was partly an accounting label, covering land the commissioners couldn't assess. Orderic's 100,000 also deserves scrutiny, since England's whole population was only around 2 million. It's important to remember that round numbers in medieval chronicles often mean a very great many rather than a count. It is, in essence, not a real number, but the equivalent to saying something like a zillion, where everyone knows it means a lot, but everyone also knows that's not a real number. The other side answers that every chronicle tradition we have, Norman, English, and Northern alike, agrees this event was exceptional. The writers of the time didn't treat the harrying of the North as being within the normal rules of pacifying civil strife. Some modern historians see what William did as a callback to a Roman style of conflict, where the Romans would leave ruins and call it peace. And I do have to agree with that assessment, since some of the accounts of the North after sound more like Carthage, after it was razed in 146 BC, than any regular medieval campaign. There's also the fact that what William did to his nominal subjects was just entirely outside the realm of how a good Christian king was supposed to behave. A king was, in the understanding of the time, the highest temporal authority within his realm, and was expected to be a patriarchal figure to his subjects. He was expected to be a figure of moral excellence, and collective punishments of Christian subjects was considered immoral behavior. Orderic, for his part, gave history its verdict in advance, and has William lament the worst sin of his life. Writing decades later, he composed a deathbed speech for William, in which the old king confesses that he fell on the English of the North like a savage lion. In this speech, he apologizes for ordering their homes and crops burnt and their herds slaughtered, and so became the agent by which countless innocents starved. Almost no historian believes William actually said it, but Orderic put the words in the king's mouth anyway, because he needed his otherwise glowing Norman king to be heroic. In the summer of 1318, a stranger walked up to a royal palace in Oxford and announced that the King of England was a fraud. The real king, he said, had been missing for over 30 years. And he could prove it because the real king was standing right there at the gate, and the real king was missing an ear. What happened next involves a derisive royal greeting, a humiliated queen, a trial for sedition, and a cat that was, according to its owner's own confession, the devil himself. Almost none of it survives in official court records, and nearly everything we know comes from chroniclers who couldn't agree on his name, his origins, or where he met his end. On one thing they agreed. For a few strange weeks, a one-eared clerk made the most powerful man in England look like an imposter in his own kingdom. It's important to understand who Edward II was and how things had been going in England, because under normal circumstances this event may not have made the history books at all. Edward II had been on the throne for 11 years, and nearly all of them had gone badly, with the crown being substantially weakened more and more throughout his reign. His father, Edward I, had been the most feared warrior king in Europe, the man who had hammered the Scots and the Welsh into submission. His son was, to put it simply, not cut from the same cloth as his powerful and feared father. He'd spent his early reign showering favors, and perhaps a good deal of love, on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight. This relationship with the king so enraged the barons of the realm that they seized Gaveston and cut him down on a hillside in 1312. Then came Bannockburn. In June 1314, Edward marched the largest English army of a generation into Scotland and watched Robert the Bruce dismantle it in 2 days. The king himself fled the field, and it was effectively the worst military humiliation England had suffered in living memory. And just when it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, it started raining, and it just didn't stop. The summers of 1315 through 1317 brought catastrophic harvest failures across northern Europe, and England starved through what historians now call the Great Famine. Grain prices spiked, livestock perished, and chroniclers wrote of people reduced to eating things no one should have to eat. In the understanding of the time, the ceaseless rains weren't some sort of meteorological phenomenon that could be explained by science. It was a sign that Edward's reign wasn't righteous, that he was failing in his duties as the ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Christendom. Through all of it, the king feuded with his most powerful baron, his cousin Thomas of Lancaster, and by 1318, the two were circling each other in an armed standoff. So that's the England John Deydras walked into. A hungry, beaten, resentful country whose king was both perceived as weak and didn't look a thing like a king should look. And that was exactly the point John Deydras intended to make when he showed up on the scene. A young clerk appeared one day at Beaumont Palace just outside Oxford's North Gate. The Lanercost Chronicle pins his arrival near the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist, late in June. The palace had history, and Richard the Lionheart had been born there, and King John after him. Though its royal days were nearly over at that time, as Edward handed it to the Carmelite friars that same year, it would play this one last role in royal history. The man at the gate is recorded under several names: John Deydras, John Deydras, John of Powderham, and in the one surviving government record, simply John of Exeter. The chronicles describe him as a literate clerk, said to be tall and good-looking, with a notable resemblance to the king himself. He was also, unmistakably, missing an ear, which will be a key part of his claim that he was the true King Edward. He claimed the royal palace as his own property, and then he claimed the kingdom itself. His narrative went like this. He was the true son of Edward I, born heir to the English throne. As an infant, he'd been left in the care of a nurse in a royal courtyard, where a deranged sow attacked him and chewed off his ear. The nurse, terrified of what the king would do to her, made a desperate choice. She found a peasant's newborn son, swapped the babies, and handed the royal child away to be raised in poverty. The peasant's boy grew up in silk and gold and was crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1308, and the real prince grew up with nothing. Well, nothing except the knowledge of who he actually was, passed down to him by his adoptive parents. Now the man who had been raised in poverty had come back, and he wanted the throne that was rightfully his. He even offered terms: single combat with Edward II, man against man, and God could decide which of them was the rightful king of England. Deydras presumably knew that King Edward wasn't inclined to combat whatsoever, which furthered the humiliation of the challenge. This was still a time when kings of England were expected to be of exceptional personal strength and martial prowess, and Edward, simply put, wasn't. According to the Lanercost Chronicle, Deydras continued to stand at Beaumont and declared openly that the man on the throne wasn't of royal blood at all and had no right to the realm. This was proclaimed at a royal palace in a university town, and the rumor spread across England with remarkable speed. The narrative was absurd, and it landed anyway, because it explained something that had been bothering people for years. Edward II didn't behave the way a medieval king was supposed to behave. The chronicles are full of bewildered accounts of his hobbies. He dug ditches, thatched roofs, rowed boats, swam with crowds of common folk, and reportedly liked eating dinner with carpenters. To a modern viewer, that sounds almost charming, a suggestion that the king was a man of the people. To the 14th century mind, it was so deeply wrong that it violated the natural order that had been set for the world. Rank was the organizing principle of the entire world, and a king who preferred hedging and ditching to jousting and combat looked like a walking contradiction of that natural order. In 1315, a man named Robert Le Messager was arrested for grumbling that England had lost Bannockburn because its king wasted his time on the activities of common folk. People had been whispering for years that Edward must be a changeling, that the royal bloodline had somewhere been switched out. They simply couldn't understand that the son of a man known as the Hammer of the Scots could be so thoroughly hammered by the Scots. And this is where the whispers really began. 2 years before the Oxford affair, another man had already been hauled into court for calling the king a changeling outright. Dedrus didn't invent that rumor, he just gave it a face that people could get behind. The Lanercost chronicler makes the connection explicitly. Some people lent the pretender their belief all the more readily, because Edward resembled his father in none of his virtues. The king enjoyed activities that peasants enjoyed, and in the style of the time, that meant that he likely inherited those proclivities from his real father. If Edward was secretly a peasant's son, then suddenly everything made sense. He enjoyed digging ditches because that's what peasants do with their days. The loss at Bannockburn also made sense because peasants weren't fit to lead troops, but to be commanded. Edward's cowardly display at the battle also, quote-unquote, proved that he may actually be of peasant stock. It didn't matter that the real Edward had been born at Carnarvon Castle in April 1284, in front of an entire royal household, a birth about as hard to fake as a coronation. Royal births were witnessed and recorded, and potential heirs to the throne were watched extremely closely at all times. The idea that the royal heir was ever left alone to the care of one woman, with no one else aware of his location, simply wasn't something that happened. If a pig had actually attacked the young king and bit off his ear, a swap with a peasant would have required the plotting of numerous different people. The story of the swap had no basis in any reality anyone could locate, but logic has never been much of a match for a narrative that people want to believe. Word of the pretender soon reached Edward himself, who was at Northampton that summer, locked in delicate negotiations with Lancaster's faction. Dedrus was arrested and brought before him, and what happened next tells you a great deal about Edward II. Standing face to face with a man publicly claiming his crown and his very identity, the king laughed. The Lanercost chronicler records that Edward greeted the prisoner mockingly as his long-lost brother. He seems to have found the whole affair tremendously funny, and one contemporary account says he proposed keeping Dedrus as his court jester. He would spend the rest of his life as a living joke about the worst thing anyone had ever said about him. The queen, for her part, wasn't laughing and didn't care for the way her weak husband was handling the situation. Isabella of France was the daughter of 2 sovereigns, raised at the most status-obsessed court in Europe, and she'd spent a decade watching her husband embarrass the crown. The author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, an unusually candid contemporary chronicle written by someone close to the royal administration, commented further. It says the affair's notoriety spread through the whole country and annoyed the queen beyond words, to the point that she became obsessed with the claim. She'd given birth to her 3rd child, a daughter named Eleanor, at Woodstock on the 18th of June, only a few days before the pretender made his stand at Beaumont. While she recovered, England was openly entertaining the idea that she'd married a peasant's son, and her children were of peasant stock. Some modern historians have wondered whether the humiliation of 1318 planted something in Isabella that bore fruit 9 years later, when she led the rebellion that ended her husband's reign. Others point out, fairly, that there's no evidence she believed a word of it, only that it wounded her reputation. The fact that someone had directly insulted the royal grace of her offspring was, to put it mildly, not something Isabella was okay with. And to give some additional context here, while Edward is remembered as an incompetent and weak ruler, Isabella is remembered as the she-wolf of France, a well-deserved reputation. The powerful barons of the realm weren't laughing either, especially when they heard of the plan to make Daedrus a court jester. With the Lancaster negotiations balanced on a knife's edge, a pretender claiming royal blood was a loose thread in a kingdom already fraying, and somebody was going to pull it. The jester plan was overruled, reportedly at the Queen's and the magnates' insistence, and John Daedrus went to trial for sedition. Facing the king's court, the man who would be king fell apart. Daedrus confessed that the whole story was an invention, and that his real father, according to the chronicles, was an Exeter tanner. His explanation for why he'd done it was, if anything, stranger than the original claim. He'd been led astray, he said, by his pet cat, which was no cat at all but the devil in disguise. The creature had tempted him with the throne of England, and its promises, he insisted, had always come true before. Unfortunately, the specific claims this cat had allegedly previously made have been lost to history. Fabricating a royal claim was sedition, and taking career advice from a satanic cat added consorting with the devil to the charge sheet. In the summer of 1318, either was enough. The sentence was carried out in stages. He was reportedly drawn behind horses, hanged on the gallows, and his body burned afterward. The flames were perhaps reserved for the diabolical part of his confession, and by several accounts, the unfortunate cat was hanged right alongside him. Historians now universally agree that the cat was, in all likelihood, simply an ordinary pet, and not the physical manifestation of the Dark Lord himself. Though I'm sure I'm not the only one who has encountered an unusually sinister cat in my day, so you be the judge. Accounts even differ on where this whole ordeal happened, and that question opens up more questions about the historicity of this entire event. Some say Oxford, where his strange campaign began, though the administrative trail points to Northampton in late July. And that trail is a short one. The one clear record the case left behind in official records is an order concerning the delivery of John of Exeter from the jail at Northampton. It notes that he was imprisoned for claiming to be the king's brother, rather than being the king himself, an entry that survives in the patent rolls of the period. That clerical scrap of evidence is, effectively, the only piece of the story that survives outside the chronicles. And if you're a longtime viewer of my Medieval Mysteries videos, or if you're just a medieval history fan, you know that chroniclers were often more concerned with a good narrative than accuracy. That brings us to the question of the truth of what happened, which cuts in two directions. First, the claim itself. No serious historian, medieval or modern, has ever treated Daedrus's story as true. The chroniclers who recorded it considered him deluded, demonic, or both, and the modern consensus is that he was mentally unwell. The idea that you would attempt to escape a sedition charge by claiming to have an evil familiar in the form of a cat lends credence to this modern idea. In essence, it's the modern equivalent to confessing to a much more serious crime in an effort to get out of another significant charge. Notably, even the people who despised Edward II never took up the pretender's cause. The Lanercost chronicler admits some foolish commoners adhered to him, but no baron backed him, and no faction used him. In an era when pretenders could raise armies, John Deidres raised only eyebrows from the powerful men who were seeking to use anything to destroy Edward. This was an era where people of uncertain origin could be championed by powerful factions, not because they believed the claim, but because it was useful. But there's a specific reason this claim likely never gained any traction whatsoever, even in those uncertain times. His claim required the impossible, a swapped heir hidden for 3 decades with not one shred of real evidence beyond the fact that Edward wasn't a strong ruler. The idea that rulers were, in essence, a roll of the dice wasn't an unfamiliar concept to the barons who could have supported him. Further, the most powerful faction at this point in medieval England was led by the king's cousin. The idea that Edward's cousin would potentially champion someone who tossed the entire royal lineage into question was simply absurd. But there's also the question about the veracity of the entire event itself, which is murkier than most retellings admit. Strip away the chronicles and almost nothing remains to verify what actually happened. The jail order proves a man was imprisoned at Northampton in 1318 for claiming royal kinship, and that's roughly where the documentary trail ends. It's notable that the surviving order didn't indicate that he was pretending to be the king himself, only that he was the king's brother. It's possible that the chronicles added the more lurid parts of the tale based on rumors that grew in the telling. The sow, the single combat challenge, the greeting from the king, the jester offer, the satanic cat, all of it comes from chroniclers writing at varying distances from events. What's beyond doubt is what the episode revealed. A clerk with one ear held up a mirror to the English monarchy, and the kingdom flinched at what it saw. Whether John claimed to be the king himself, talked into it by a cat, or whether he simply claimed to be the king's brother, will likely never be known for certain. 9 years later, in January 1327, Edward II was deposed in favor of his own teenage son in a revolution led by his wife, Isabella of France. He became the first English king since the conquest to be stripped of his throne. The men who pulled him down didn't need a story about a deranged sow ripping off the true king's ear and a secretive nursemaid. By then, they'd settled on a simpler claim, that whoever Edward was by birth, he had never truly been fit to sit on the throne of England. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment saying what you've learned from this video, or what you like to do while you watch or listen. On April 13th, 1314, a proclamation rang out through the streets of London in the king's name. England was 10 weeks away from one of the worst military disasters in its history at Bannockburn, and the crown had every reason to be thinking about other things. Yet this decree said nothing about what was to come. It described a menace loose in the fields around the city, something so loud and so disruptive that anyone caught near it now faced prison. The menace was a ball that Englishmen had started kicking around with feet for entertainment. The man who actually issued the order was Nicholas de Farndone, the mayor of London, acting on behalf of King Edward II. The text was written in Norman French, the administrative language of England's ruling class. A copy was entered into one of the city's books of record, the Liber Memorandorum, where it survives to this day in the City of London's archives. The complaint it laid out was simple. There was a great uproar in the city, it said, caused by crowds hustling over large footballs in the public fields, and from this chaos, many evils might arise. So the mayor commanded, in the king's name, that the game no longer be played within the city, and anyone who ignored the order faced imprisonment. Farndone couldn't have known what he was starting. His order is widely considered the first official ban on football anywhere in England, and one of the earliest surviving official references to the game at all. The French text refers to large balls kicked by the foot, which is about as close to a birth certificate as the word football has. Generations of kings and town councils would spend the next 3.5 centuries trying to do exactly what Farndone did in 1314, and they'd fail just as completely. By one common count, England alone saw more than 30 attempts to ban the game between 1314 and 1667. In the spring of 1314, Edward II was preparing to march an enormous army north into Scotland. The proclamation formed part of a wider effort to keep the peace in his capital while he was away. London's merchants had reportedly been complaining for some time about the noise and the unruly gatherings that came with the games. With the king and much of the realm's fighting strength about to head north to disaster, the last thing anyone wanted was a city full of large, excitable crowds chasing a ball. To grasp why anyone would treat a ball game as a public emergency, we have to forget everything the word football or soccer brings to mind. Medieval football had no referee and barely any rules that we would recognize today at the World Cup. It was a mass scramble between rival crowds, sometimes whole parishes or whole trades, with an unlimited number of players on each side. The ball that was used was often an inflated pig's bladder, sometimes wrapped in a leather casing to increase the durability. In the countryside, Shrovetide matches could run between neighboring villages, with the goal posts set miles apart and the ball wrestled through streets. The earliest detailed account of ball games in London comes from William Fitzstephen, a clerk who'd served Thomas Becket and who wrote an affectionate description of the city in the 1170s. He describes how, after dinner on Shrove Tuesday, the youth of the city would pour out into the fields for the famous game of ball. Every school had its own ball, and so did every trade, and everyone got involved. The older men rode out on horseback to watch the young ones compete, and Fitzstephen claims the spectacle stirred up the watchers' own lost youth. Notably, he never calls the game football, and what he saw may have been tamer than what came later. But the basic picture is already there in the 12th century. Holidays, crowds, fields outside the walls, and a ball. What came later was considerably rougher, and legal records from the period sometimes treat football matches less like sport and more like criminal incidents. At Oldham in Northumberland in 1280, a player named Henry de Ellington reportedly perished during a game after running into another man's belt knife. In 1321, a priest named William de Spalding received a dispensation from Pope John XXII after a friend collided with him during a match. That man struck the sheathed knife at William's belt and passed away from the wound 6 days later. Nobody had drawn a weapon in either case, but the game itself, played at full speed by men carrying everyday blades, was dangerous enough on its own. Add in trampled stalls, broken windows, gambling, and the old grudges between neighborhoods that a match could reignite, and the merchants' complaints start to look reasonable. Notably, King Edward II, the man who was behind the ban, may in fact have been the first king to play football. This is speculation, but as discussed, Edward was the kind of man who shunned the company of nobles to enjoy time together with the common folk. Whether he actually played the game with his subjects hasn't been recorded, but given that he was digging ditches and doing other forms of rustic labor, it wouldn't be surprising. These were the exact sort of men who the history books record as being the early adopters of football. Whatever Londoners thought of the proclamation, they don't seem to have obeyed it for long. Records show that the game continued onwards, and people were prosecuted for playing it, generally in situations where games became highly unruly. City records from 1409 show that officials were trying to stop people from collecting money for the games. This suggests that the ban may have had the effect of turning football into something closer to what we would recognize at the World Cup today. The complaint that got football banned was largely the issue of the complete chaos these makeshift soccer games unleashed. It's speculated that the initial ban actually forced players to approach it in a more organized way. The 1409 attempt to ban funding games provides strong evidence for this, since it implies organized sport, rather than a few hundred guys kicking around a ball. Notably, in the intervening years, there were a number of other attempts to ban football, though these bans were less about unruliness and more about idleness. In 1349, Edward III, son of the king behind the first ban, ordered able-bodied men to give up football and practice archery instead, since the kingdom's defense rested on its bowmen. Richard II tried again in 1389, and Henry IV did the same in 1401, both doing so for reasons of national security. North of the border, the Scottish Parliament decreed in 1424 that no man should play football, on pain of a small fine. A later act of 1457 banned football and an early form of golf together for the same security reason. Henry VIII, who reportedly owned a pair of football boots made by his own royal shoemaker, attempted a ban of his own in the 1540s. By 1608, the authorities in Manchester were still complaining that disorderly persons kept smashing glass windows every year with their football. In the end, the game outlasted royal proclamations and magistrates alike, until, in the 19th century, they finally stopped fighting it and wrote rules for it instead. By that point, football and other forms of organized sport had come to be seen as the opposite of idleness and rowdiness. Instead, it was seen as instilling physical prowess, martial virtues, and a sense of competition in the young men who were busy conquering large portions of the world. Here's a question that has started more academic fistfights than almost anything else in early English history, and it sounds deceptively simple. When the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, how many of them actually showed up? Was it a flood of tens of thousands of farming families dragging their lives across the North Sea? Or was it a thin crust of warlords and their retinues, a few thousand men who took over the top of the social pyramid and let everyone else carry on speaking a slightly different language? The answer matters more than it seems, because it decides whether England was built on the bones of a replaced people or simply rebranded by their Germanic conquerors. And for 2 centuries, the smartest historians in the room couldn't agree on which it was, until modern science intervened to clear up the historical mystery. The trouble starts with the sources, because the people who lived nearest to these events weren't exactly running a census. Our earliest narrative comes from Gildas, a British cleric writing in scathing sermon-like prose probably around the middle of the 6th century. He tells us a proud and foolish British ruler invited Saxon warriors over to defend the island against raiders from the north. These mercenaries, once settled, complained their pay wasn't generous enough, then turned on their hosts with fire and fury. What Gildas never does is give anything approaching a ballpark estimate of how many Anglo-Saxons actually arrived. Roughly 200 years later, the monk Bede picked up that same story and tidied it into something far more orderly. Writing in 731, he identified 3 distinct peoples behind the migration: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. He pinned the arrival to a specific year, 449, under the command of 2 brothers who weren't yet given names. Bede also passed on a striking detail. The homeland of the Angles, he claimed, lay empty in his own day, deserted because so many had picked up and left. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, assembled from the 9th century onward, names those brothers as Hengist and Horsa. It has them land at Ebbsfleet in Kent, and provides an account of Horsa being slain at a battle around 455. It's a tidy narrative, and almost none of it can be trusted as straightforward historical reporting. Bede was writing nearly 3 centuries after the events, with an agenda about a unified English church, and the chronicle is later still. Bede, for his part, was working from older sources that haven't survived, but the fact was he was writing to prove that England was one people under one church. Even the label for the whole episode, The Coming of the Saxons, was a phrase that later medieval chroniclers fastened onto, rather than anything the first witnesses used. We do get one outside voice who weighed in on the Anglo-Saxon migration, an Eastern Roman historian known as Procopius of Caesarea. He was a historian working in the Eastern Mediterranean in the mid-6th century, who mentioned, almost in passing, that after the Romans lost their grip on Britain around 411, demographics changed. He correctly notes they never got it back, and that the island was now home to Saxons, Angles, Frisians, and Britons living side by side. That's it. That's the contemporary paper trail for one of the largest cultural shifts in European history. So if the writers won't give us numbers, the temptation is to reverse engineer them, and this is where it gets properly difficult. Nobody knows how many people lived in Britain when the Romans left. A figure you'll often see is that the population had slumped to somewhere around 1 million by the 5th century, battered by the collapse of Roman administration. But that number itself is highly controversial, and some historians argue it stayed considerably higher. Against that uncertain backdrop, the estimates for how many newcomers arrived have swung wildly, and not by a little. At the low end, some archaeologists have argued for as few as 10 or 20,000 migrants over several generations, a trickle that rose to the top. At the high end, others have defended figures of 100 to 200,000 spread across roughly a century. Part of the reason the guesses vary so much is that you can't simply count graves and stop there. You also have to assume how fast the newcomers multiplied once they'd settled. A difference of 1% in the yearly birth rate, sustained across a century, throws the final total off by an enormous margin. One influential reconstruction leaned on a grim physical clue. Studying early Anglo-Saxon graves, a researcher noticed that men buried with weapons tended to be taller than men buried without them. This researcher read that height gap as a marker of two distinct populations sharing the same cemeteries. Under this theory, the Anglo-Saxon men who came to Britain were, by and large, the strongest fighting men the Germanic continental peoples had to offer. Men who weren't fit for combat were, in essence, left behind in what is now Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. The native Britons, on the other hand, didn't have a similar selection bias towards tall, powerful fighting men, because they didn't have an influx of powerful outsiders to help them. Build a model on that foundation, and you can argue for a substantial influx rather than a token one. A separate exercise crunched the logistics of moving men, and eventually their families, across the North Sea. It concluded that moving around 250,000 people from northwestern Germany to East Anglia was entirely feasible inside a few decades, with a modest fleet of boats. The point of that calculation wasn't that it definitely happened. It was that the sheer scale people had once dismissed as impossible turned out to be perfectly doable. Then there's the strangest piece of evidence of all, and it's one you can still hear today. When the Anglo-Saxons settled, the language of Roman and pre-Roman Britain almost vanished from the eastern lowlands. Old English absorbed remarkably few words from the Brittonic tongue spoken by the existing population, and the map filled up with Germanic place names. The older Celtic names survived mainly out in the west of the country. For a long time, that linguistic wipeout was treated as evidence of a complete replacement of the native population by the Germanic settlers. Surely a language only dies that completely, scholars reasoned, when the people speaking it have largely been swept aside. But here's the thing, and it's the crack that split the whole field open. Languages don't actually need a massacre to disappear. History is littered with cases where a small, dominant group imposed its speech on a much larger population that simply switched over within a few generations. This was much more common in societies where people didn't have a tradition of writing. For instance, when the Old Prussians were conquered by the Teutonic Knights, within a few generations, most of them were speaking German and thought of themselves as Germans. If a confident Old English-speaking elite controlled land, law, and status, the locals had every incentive to adopt their language and very little to record their own. The near-total triumph of English, in other words, could point to a tidal wave of settlers, or it could point to a small ruling class whose prestige did the heavy lifting. The same fact supports two opposite stories, which is exactly why nobody could close the argument. By the late 20th century, the debate had hardened into two camps. The traditional view, sometimes called the migrationist position, took the old chronicles roughly at their word and pictured large numbers of Germanic settlers displacing or absorbing the Britons. The Challenger view, which gathered real momentum from the 1970s, argued that the initial arrivals were a small warrior elite, offering an attractive new social order. Most of the people living in lowland Britain were natives who gradually became culturally Anglo-Saxon. Change the burial customs and the language, add in some intermarriage, and you've changed the culture without needing to move many settlers. It was an elegant idea, and for a couple of decades it carried the day, with the old view thought of as incorrect and perhaps a bit outdated. The Anglo-Saxon migration had been reframed as something more similar to the Norman conquest. The Normans replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite almost completely, but at the end of the day, this was just a replacement of the absolute upper crust of society. Around the turn of the millennium, a study of the Y chromosome, the slice of DNA passed straight down on the male line, changed the picture. It compared men from a band of Central English towns with samples from Wales and from the Frisian coast of the continent. The English samples looked startlingly continental, close enough to the North Sea populations that the researchers suggested a mass migration with a very large male contribution. That seemed to hand the wind straight back to the migrationists, but the numbers were so lopsided, though, that they created a fresh puzzle. If half or more of the male lineages in England were continental, but the archaeology suggested a modest number of actual settlers, how did so few newcomers change the genetic makeup so much? A 2006 model suggested that a relatively small Anglo-Saxon group, holding social and economic advantages, could have completely changed the genetic makeup of England. The model stated they could have out-reproduced the locals to the point where Germanic male lineages dominated the gene pool within roughly 15 generations. Critics pushed back hard, pointing out that the Y chromosome data could be explained without imagining anything so rigid. Meanwhile, a popular account published the same year swung the other way entirely, arguing that most British ancestry was far older than the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon migration was, it was argued, a minor event that had relatively little genetic impact. The deadlock only began to break when researchers stopped guessing from living people and started reading the genomes of the dead. An early breakthrough sequenced a small group of ancient individuals dug up near Cambridge, spanning the Iron Age through the Anglo-Saxon period. It used them to estimate that people in eastern England today carry, on average, around 38% of their ancestry from the Anglo-Saxon incomers. Crucially, those ancient migrants looked genetically closest to modern Dutch, northwestern German, and Danish populations, exactly where the old sources pointed. The decisive study landed a few years later, and its scale dwarfed everything before it. Researchers analyzed several hundred ancient genomes, including 278 individuals from England, set against thousands of comparison samples. In early medieval eastern and southern England, roughly 75% of the ancestry came from communities across the North Sea. But the same data demolished the idea of a clean replacement just as firmly, and the newcomers mixed with the locals, and they did it differently from place to place. At a cemetery near Dover, the team reconstructed a family tree across 4 generations and caught the exact moment migrant and native lines married into each other. At a Sussex site, by contrast, people of settler and local ancestry seem to have been buried apart, hinting at some social distance. The grave goods told their own subtle story of class differences in Anglo-Saxon England. Women of Anglo-Saxon descent were more often buried with brooches and beads, while weapons turned up at a slightly higher frequency amongst Anglo-Saxon men. All that brings us back to the central question, the historical mystery that we started with. The number of Anglo-Saxon migrants was almost certainly large enough to make up 3/4 of the gene pool in the early medieval East. This puts the older estimates of a couple 100,000 newcomers comfortably back in play, and potentially even understates them. The elegant theory of a tiny conquering elite, the one that ruled the universities for a generation or two, hasn't survived contact with the ancient DNA. And yet the migrationists don't get a clean victory either, because the settlers didn't actually wipe anyone out. They married into the existing population and farmed alongside it, leaving today's English with a deep continental inheritance laid over an older island ancestry. The honest answer to how many Anglo-Saxons came is that we still can't give a single confident figure, but the floor keeps rising. The picture that's emerging is neither a gentle takeover nor a clean conquest. It's a migration big enough to reshape a population and complex enough to leave the English people with one foot on each shore. In the summer of 1674, workmen demolishing a stone staircase in the Tower of London hit something 10 feet down. It was a wooden chest, and inside it were 2 sets of small bones, distinctively human in nature. Nobody had reported them missing, and nobody ever claimed them. Yet almost everyone in England knew, or thought they knew, exactly who they were. The problem is that the 2 boys those bones were assumed to belong to had vanished 191 years earlier, and to this day, no one can prove what happened to them. On April 9, 1483, King Edward IV passed away at Westminster, just shy of his 41st birthday. He'd been a big, vigorous man for most of his life, and his decline caught nearly everyone off guard. His heir was his 12-year-old son, now Edward V, who at that moment was more than 150 miles away at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. He'd been raised under the supervision of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Word of his father's passing reached Ludlow on April 14th, and the boy who received it had spent almost his whole life being prepared for exactly this moment. That word maternal, in relation to the uncle he was raised with, matters a great deal here. Edward IV had married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively minor gentry stock on her father's side. Her large family had spent 2 decades accumulating offices, marriages, and enemies. The old nobility resented them, and none more so than the men who feared the Woodvilles were positioning themselves to control the boy king. Edward V had a younger brother too, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, who was in London with their mother, and between the 2 boys stood an entire dynasty's future. The late king's will reportedly named his surviving brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of the realm. Richard was 30 years old, an experienced soldier, and by every appearance a loyal lieutenant who'd governed the north of England capably for years. He was also, at the moment of his brother's death, hundreds of miles away in Yorkshire. The council in London leaned toward crowning the boy quickly, and ruling through a council instead, an arrangement that would have cut the protector's role out from under him. What happened over the next 12 weeks sparked one of the most significant historical mysteries England has ever seen. The new king set out from Ludlow for London in late April, escorted by Earl Rivers and a company of some 2,000 men. Richard of Gloucester rode south to meet the party, joined along the way by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. On the night of April 29th, Rivers left the king at Stony Stratford and rode back to Northampton to dine with the two dukes. By the accounts we have, it was a pleasant evening. The next morning, Rivers found the inn locked around him and himself under arrest. Richard and Buckingham then rode to Stony Stratford, took custody of the 12-year-old king, and arrested his half-brother Richard Grey, along with his chamberlain, Thomas Vaughan. Edward V reportedly protested that he trusted the men his father had given him, and it did him no good. When word reached London, Queen Elizabeth Woodville grabbed her younger son and her daughters and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She'd done it before, during an earlier crisis, and she clearly understood what an armed change of custody meant. Richard entered London with the king on May 4th, publicly displaying wagon loads of weapons he claimed the Woodvilles had stockpiled against him. The council accepted him as protector, and Edward V was lodged first at the Bishop of London's palace, and then, on or about May 19th, moved to the Tower of London. That detail sounds extremely sinister in hindsight, but it wasn't looked at that way at the time. The Tower was a royal residence, and kings traditionally stayed there before their coronations. Edward's, originally planned for early May, was rescheduled for June 22nd. Preparations went forward, and Parliament was summoned in the young king's name. And as a brief aside for any of the trivia fans in my audience, the Tower of London officially remains a royal palace today, even though it hasn't been used that way since the 16th century. Then came June, and everything accelerated. On Friday, June 13th, during a council meeting at the Tower, Richard accused William, Lord Hastings, of plotting against him. Hastings had been Edward IV's closest friend, and the man whose warnings had arguably helped Richard secure the protectorship in the first place. But it didn't matter. He was dragged out and beheaded over a length of timber without anything resembling a trial, an act that was viewed as tyrannical by virtually everyone. Several other councillors, including two bishops, were arrested in the same meeting. 3 days later, on June 16th, armed men surrounded Westminster Abbey, a highly offensive act. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bourchier, went in to persuade the Queen to release her younger son so he could attend his brother's coronation. Whether she believed the promise or simply recognized that the sanctuary could be breached, she gave up the 9-year-old, and Richard of Shrewsbury joined Edward V in the Tower. Both heirs of the House of York were now behind the same walls, in the custody of the same uncle who, in short order, would have no reason to assure their safety. The coronation, as you may have guessed by this point, never happened. On June 22nd, a preacher named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross on the pointed theme that illegitimate offshoots should never take root. He argued that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because the late king had already been contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. If true, it made both boys illegitimate and theoretically unable to inherit the throne. The claim reportedly traced back to Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, though no proof was ever produced in a church court, which was the only body with jurisdiction to rule on it. On June 25th, Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan were beheaded at Pontefract Castle. On June 26th, an Assembly of Lords petitioned Richard to take the crown, and he graciously accepted, I say with a hint of sarcasm. On July 6th, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III at Westminster, co-opting the coronation plans for Edward V for his own usage. When his first parliament met in January 1484, it passed an act called Titulus Regius, writing the story into law and formally declaring the sons of Edward IV illegitimate. The boys, meanwhile, were presumably still somewhere inside the tower, though what condition they were in was unclear. For what happened next, we lean heavily on a witness nobody knew existed until 1934. Dominic Mancini was an Italian cleric visiting London that spring and summer. He wrote up an account of Richard's takeover for his patron, the Archbishop of Vienne in France, finishing it by December 1483, within months of leaving England. His manuscript then sat unnoticed in a municipal library in Lille until the historian Charles Armstrong found it and published it, giving historians something extraordinary. It was a contemporary report with no stake in the Tudor versus Richard conflict that came later. It was, in essence, a completely neutral report on the happenings in England at the time for an archbishop in France who simply wanted intelligence on the matter. Mancini says that after Hastings was slain, the boys' attendants were gradually withdrawn, and the brothers were pulled back into the inner apartments of the tower. They were seen more and more rarely behind the bars and windows, until eventually they stopped appearing at all. The last of their servants to attend them, a physician, reported that the young Edward made daily confession because he believed death was coming for him. Mancini left England knowing nothing more, and he admits as much, writing that he couldn't discover whether the boy had been done away with, or how. A London Civic Chronicle, the Great Chronicle, later recalled the brothers shooting arrows and playing in the Tower Garden in the weeks after mid-June, and then the sightings simply end. After that summer, official records stopped mentioning the sons of Edward IV altogether, and no surviving document places either boy anywhere on Earth again. By autumn, the silence had curdled into rumor, and in October 1483, a rebellion rose against Richard, initially aiming to free Edward V and restore him. Partway through, the plan changed because word had spread that the boys had been eliminated on the orders of the cruel tyrant Richard. The rebels shifted their backing to an exiled claimant to the throne named Henry Tudor instead. The rising failed, and Buckingham, who had joined it against the king he'd helped crown, was executed at Salisbury on November 2nd. By January 1484, the account of what Richard had allegedly done had traveled abroad in a very public way. In a formal address to the Estates General at Tours, the Chancellor of France declared that the sons of Edward IV had been slain and their kingdom handed to the man responsible. The Crowland Chronicle, written by someone close to the government within 3 years of the events, confirms the rumored sequence of events. The boys were held under specially appointed guard, and a rumor spread that they had perished by some act of violence, though nobody knew how. Richard could have ended the rumor at any moment by simply producing the boys, but he never did. Nobody held a funeral, and nobody in power pointed to a culprit or offered any explanation at all. Yet in March 1484, Elizabeth Woodville came out of sanctuary and placed her daughters in Richard's care after he swore a public oath to protect them. Many historians believe this wasn't the act of a woman who believed that Richard had ordered the deaths of her sons. Everything most people think they know about what happened comes from accounts written decades later, under the dynasty that took Richard's throne. Richard himself perished at Bosworth in August 1485, fighting the same Henry Tudor the rebels had rallied behind, and the winners spent the next century writing the history. That's not automatically disqualifying, but it means the famous version deserves scrutiny as a story with its own history. Notably, Henry VII behaved almost as strangely as Richard had. After taking the throne in 1485, he had Titulus Regius repealed and ordered every copy destroyed. He never staged an inquest or announced the boys' deaths, even though proving them dead would have shored up his own position enormously. To some, this indicates that Edward V may have still been alive, since if an inquest proved that he wasn't dead, Henry VII would have been a usurper. The canonical account of the princes in the Tower comes from Thomas More, writing around 1513, 30 years after the fact, in a history he never finished in his lifetime. In his telling, Richard sent an agent to order the Constable of the Tower, Robert Brackenbury, to do away with the boys, and Brackenbury refused. Richard then handed the commission to Sir James Tyrrell, who rode to London and used two men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to smother the princes under their bedding as they slept. The bodies, More says, were buried at the foot of a staircase under a heap of stones, though he adds that a priest later moved them to a spot nobody could identify. More claims the story came out when Tyrrell, arrested in 1502 for helping a Yorkist fugitive, confessed before his execution in May 1502. No text of any confession has ever been found, and Dighton, the supposed hands-on perpetrator, apparently walked free. It's easy to dismiss More's account as Tudor propaganda, and plenty of people have. But in 2021, the historian Tim Thornton published research showing that Miles Forrest's sons were serving at Henry VIII's court in the 1510s, moving in the same circles as More himself. In other words, More may have gotten his information from the family of one of the alleged perpetrators, which would make his account something closer to journalism. Polydore Virgil, the historian Henry VII commissioned, also names Tyrrell as the man responsible, acting on Richard's orders. Shakespeare took More's version and welded it into the culture a few generations later, making Tyrrell a one-dimensional physical embodiment of evil. These accounts made it seem as though this historical mystery had been closed, but it's more complicated than that. The case never really closed because people kept showing up claiming to be the princes. In 1487, a boy was crowned in Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral as a rival king of England, and an invasion followed on his behalf, ending at the Battle of Stoke that June. The official account says he was an impostor named Lambert Simnel, coached to impersonate a different Yorkist heir. Henry VII pardoned the child and put him to work turning spits in the royal kitchens, where he eventually worked his way up to falconer. Around the same time, Henry stripped Elizabeth Woodville of her estates, and she withdrew to Bermondsey Abbey, a retreat some have connected to the Dublin affair. Then, in 1491, a far more dangerous figure surfaced in Ireland, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince, allegedly spared and smuggled abroad. History remembers him as Perkin Warbeck, and much of royal Europe treated him as the real thing, or found it useful to. Margaret of Burgundy, the boy's own aunt, recognized him as a family member. The King of Scotland, James IV, married him to Lady Catherine Gordon, a noblewoman from his own family, in 1496. After a failed landing in Cornwall in 1497, he was captured and confessed to being a commoner's son from the French-speaking city of Tournai. I have to mention here that he made that confession in Henry VII's custody, and let's just say Henry wasn't accepting anything other than his own official narrative. He was hanged at Tyburn in November 1499, after being made to read that confession to the crowd one final time. Notably, this pretender physically resembled Edward IV, with many historians believing that he was actually one of Edward's numerous illegitimate sons. Then there are the bones. The chest found in 1674 lay 10 feet beneath a staircase, said to lead from the royal lodgings to the chapel of the White Tower. This is uncomfortably close to where More said the boys were first buried, at least if you ignore the part where More said they'd been moved. The remains were reportedly tossed aside with the rubble at first, then gathered up once somebody grasped what they might be, and the king's own surgeon, John Knight, recorded the find. Charles II accepted the identification, and in 1678, the bones were placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren and installed in Westminster Abbey. Beneath the urn, there's an inscription that names the boys and squarely blames their uncle. In 1933, the urn was opened and the contents examined by Lawrence Tanner and the anatomist William Wright. They concluded that the ages of the remains largely matched up to the brothers, but the identification was problematic. To give the most egregious example, these experts had failed to realize that animal bones were also mixed into the urn. Modern testing could answer real questions, especially after 2012, when Richard III's own skeleton was found under a parking lot in Leicester. He was identified through mitochondrial DNA matched to living descendants of his sister. But Westminster Abbey, with royal backing, has declined every request to reopen the urn. Though the current king is reportedly warmer to the idea than his mother was, any examination would need approval from King Charles. Ultimately, the crown may have little incentive to uncover an answer. Any discovery touching the fate, identity, or legitimacy of a disputed royal heir wouldn't remain confined to one medieval mystery. It could raise questions about the chain of succession that followed, and therefore about the historical foundations on which every English and British monarch since has stood. Modern monarchy doesn't depend legally on proving an unbroken medieval bloodline, but royal authority has always drawn strength from continuity and lawful descent. A conclusive finding could expose that continuity as more fragile, political, and improvised than official tradition prefers to admit. That doesn't prove a deliberate cover-up, and concerns about disturbing royal graves may be genuine, yet secrecy also protects stability. For the crown, uncertainty is safer than an answer that might transform an old historical debate into a symbolic challenge to the legitimacy of the dynasty. Beside Gripsholm Castle, about an hour west of Stockholm, stands a stone that's been repeating the same message for nearly 1,000 years. A woman named Tola raised it for her son Harold to remember his exploits in a journey led by his half-brother. It says that he and his companions sailed boldly far away in search of gold, that they fed the eagle in the east, which was the old Norse way of saying they were victorious in battle. Then it says that the group of men perished in the south, in a land the carver called Sörkland. Roughly 25 other stones stand scattered across the farmland of central Sweden, raised by other mothers, fathers, brothers, and sons. Nearly all of them say some version of the same thing. Each remembers a man who sailed east with a leader named Ingvar. Around the year 1040, somewhere beyond the edge of the world the Norse understood, an entire Swedish fleet went out and effectively ceased to exist. This is what we actually know about the man who led it there, a person who has become known to history as Ingvar the Far-Traveled. Sweden in the 1030s was a kingdom halfway through changing its mind about everything. Christianity was pushing into the old heartlands of the kingdom, and missionary bishops were winning converts en masse. The great age of westward raiding was winding down, since England had been squeezed for tribute for a generation. The ambitious young men of the Mälaren Valley looked east instead, toward the river roads through Russia that had made their great-grandfathers rich. Ingvar belonged to the top of this society, though exactly where at the top is a question that has bothered historians for well over a century. The saga later written about him claims his father was Eymund, a warrior descended from King Eric the Victorious, which would make Ingvar a kinsman of the Swedish royal house. One school of scholars accepts that account more or less as written, while a second argues that he was a nephew of a Swedish king. A third theory reads a small cluster of runestones as one family group and concludes that Ingvar was a son of King Emund the Old, and effectively a potential heir to the Swedish throne. Notably, even the medieval author of Ingvar's saga, admitted the confusion about the origins of Ingvar. He wrote that some made Ingvar a son of the reigning king because it seemed more honorable. Whatever the exact genealogy, one thing survives the muddle. This was a man important enough that families across an entire region let their sons follow him off the map. The saga says Ingvar was raised at the royal court and asked the king to grant him a significant title and was refused. So he did what ambitious Norsemen had done for 2 centuries when the top job at home was taken. He decided to go and win a realm of his own. He gathered men and ships, reportedly 30 of them, and sailed east across the Baltic into Garthariki, the Norse name for the lands we now know as Russia and Ukraine. According to the saga, there was family waiting at the far end of that trip that could assist the expedition. Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise had married a daughter of the Swedish king, and his court had employed Swedish fighting men for decades. Under one version of the narrative, the one where Ingvar was the son of the reigning king, this made Yaroslav Ingvar's brother-in-law. According to the saga, Ingvar stayed with Yaroslav for around 3 years, learning the languages he'd need further south. Then, sometime in the late 1030s, he took his fleet down one of the great rivers flowing toward the Caspian and sailed clean out of recorded history and into something a bit more hazy. The likeliest practical motive was trade, but not in the peaceful way this word might bring to mind. For most of the 10th century, Islamic silver had poured up the Volga in staggering quantities, and much of it ended up buried in Swedish soil. By Ingvar's lifetime, that flow had faltered badly due to the changing political map in the region. An armed expedition to reopen the old silver routes, part embassy and part invasion, would have made perfect sense to the men funding it. The powers that had once controlled those roads, the Khazars on the lower Volga and the Bulgars upstream, were no longer the obstacles they'd been a century earlier. The standard reconstruction, built on the saga's chronology and the annals, has the venture running from roughly 1036 to 1041, 5 years from departure to catastrophe. The runestones are why anyone takes this saga narrative seriously, because without them, there wouldn't be much in the way of evidence. Around 26 of them commemorate men of the expedition, making the Ingvar stones one of the largest groups of memorial stones ever raised for a single Viking Age event. This was surpassed only by the stones for the men who served in the Eastern Roman Empire and in England. 24 stand in the old Swedish core provinces around Lake Mälaren, with 2 more to the south in Östergötland. The inscriptions are short and formulaic, making it very clear that none of the men came back from this armed adventure. A typical one records that a father steered his own ship east with Ingvar, then asks God to help his spirit. Many of the stones carry crosses and Christian prayers, while others are pagan, which tells you something about the transformative moment Sweden was living through. Sörkland itself is the thread tying the group together, aside from Ingvar. The name generally meant the land of the Saracens, the Muslim world somewhere south and east of the Caspian Sea, and it's rare in the runic record. Only about 9 inscriptions anywhere mention it, and most of them belong to this one disaster. Even the name is slippery, possibly derived from the word for Saracens, possibly from something else entirely, and that vagueness is part of the problem. For the Vikings who raised the rune stones, Sörkland was less a country or a region than a direction. Then there's the strangest absence in the whole body of evidence. No rune stone was ever raised for Ingvar himself. The Gripsholm stone remembers Harald, described as Ingvar's brother, and scholars have argued about that for generations. The favored explanation is that Tola was only Harald's mother, and the 2 men were half-brothers, so Ingvar's own memorial would have fallen to other kin, and simply hasn't survived. Others suspect the word brother here meant a sworn brother, a comrade in arms, rather than an actual biological brother. Either way, the man the whole catastrophe is named after has no surviving stone in his own country or anywhere else. The runestones tell us the men died on the journey, and the saga tries to tell us how. Once Ingvar's fleet leaves Yaroslav's territory, the narrative fills with wonders, as was common in medieval travelers' tales. The crews cross paths with giants, and they encounter a dragon called Yakulus, resting on a hoard of gold, and the saga tells of their failed attempts to get the loot. They reach a gleaming city ruled by a beautiful scholar queen named Silkasif, who speaks many languages, offers Ingvar her hand and her kingdom, and asks him to stay. He winters there and then presses on anyway, leaving behind a potential life with this radiant foreign queen. Further downriver, the fleet is attacked by pirates whose ships spew fire from brass tubes. This is a detail that sounds suspiciously like a Norse memory of Greek fire, the Eastern Roman Empire's naval flame weapon. Through all of it runs a drumbeat of warnings about women they encountered along the way, and in the saga's telling, that's what finally ends the expedition. Local women come into the camp at night. The men take them in despite Ingvar's orders, and sickness follows. Disease tears through the fleet faster than any battle could, and men perish in droves with no enemy to strike back at. Ingvar himself sickens and dies in 1041, at just 25 years old by the saga's count. His companions carry his body back upriver to Silkasif's city, where she's said to have honored him and later pushed for a church to bear his name. The saga says the survivors' ships scattered on the way home, each crew refusing to follow another after the disaster. According to the tale, all the men perish on the journey home, except an Icelander called Kettle, who lived to pass the story on. The saga doesn't even stop there, and it pushes the narrative on into the second generation. It gives Ingvar a son, Svein, who grows up, raises a fleet of his own, and retraces his father's route into the east. In the story, he fights heathens along the rivers and ultimately settles in the east, rather than return to a Sweden where many wanted to make him king. Most scholars treat this second voyage as a literary sequel rather than a record of anything. But despite that, it shows how badly the Norse world wanted this story to have a next chapter, some payoff beyond a fleet full of dead men. That's the legend. And the question is how much of it anyone should actually believe, which is the heart of this historical mystery. Here's the thing about the saga. It was written down a very long way from the events, in both distance and time. The earliest surviving manuscripts are Icelandic and date from the early 15th century. They're thought to be translations of a lost Latin original composed before the year 1200, most likely by Otter Snorrason, a Benedictine monk at a monastery in northern Iceland. That puts a century and a half between the expedition and the first known text, with the surviving copies another 2 centuries downstream. The saga then sat in manuscript until 1762, when it was finally printed in Stockholm, 7 full centuries after the fleet went out. Otter Snorrason was also a man of education, and scholars have found that the saga borrows from literature of the period, including a medieval romance about the biblical Joseph. The dragon and the giants are, for their part, standard furniture of the saga genre, which are never short on fantastical elements, even for real historical events. And yet the saga can't be dismissed as pure invention, because independent evidence keeps brushing against it. Several personal names in the story match names carved on the Ingvar stones, which is more significant than it sounds. The saga of Ingvar was written down in Iceland centuries later by someone who had no reason to know the runestones even existed, let alone the names on them. 3 separate Icelandic annals enter Ingvar's death under the year 1041, probably drawing on a 13th century compilation. The stones and the annals converge from different directions on the same picture. A real man leading a real fleet into a disaster with a fixed date. There may even be a third witness, someone who stood outside the Viking world. Adam of Bremen was a German churchman writing in the 1070s within living memory of the disaster. He recorded that a son of the Swedish king had perished with his whole army in a distant country he called the Land of Women, where poison was slipped into the springs. Adam treated the episode as God's punishment on a king who defied the archbishopric over the appointment of a bishop. Several historians read that strange notice as a garbled echo of the same lost fleet, and as outside near contemporary confirmation of the event. And personally, I think that solves the mystery of whether the key events were historical or not, especially when taken with all the other evidence. It's not absolute proof. But as with most things in the medieval period, absolute confirmation of most events is difficult. There's still another mystery here, though, and that's where Ingvar and his men actually perished. Sörkland doesn't match up to any real place on a map, and even in the Viking world, it was simply a vague directional concept. The traditional answer is the Caspian, which would make Ingvar's venture the last in a long line of Viking expeditions to those shores, closing a chapter that had been open for over a century. But there's a more precise possibility, and it potentially provides even further evidence for Ingvar's expedition. The Georgian chronicles record that a force of Varangians, reportedly 3,000 of them, arrived in Georgia around 1040. The Georgian king Bagrat IV took 700 inland to fight at the Battle of Sasireti in 1042, where his side lost the day to a rebel duke backed by Byzantine forces. A Swedish archaeologist who spent years on the problem argued that the chronicle's sequence lines up with the saga's geography remarkably well. More cautious scholars answer that making the two accounts fit requires a fair amount of selective reading and fudging the timelines. There's also another option, suggesting that Ingvar's expedition may have been decimated by the Eastern Romans. In 1043, a Viking fleet attacked Constantinople and was largely destroyed, partly by Greek fire, and those fire-spewing pirate ships in the saga fit that engagement comfortably. A few researchers have even tied the expedition to earlier raids on the emirates of the Caucasus in the early 1030s. The sources, as they stand, allow several routes to the same grave, and it's even possible that different crews met different ends, scattered across half a continent. Combat losses at a place like Sasireti or against the Greeks, followed by sickness burning through the survivors, would ultimately explain everything on the stones and in the saga. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to recommend a historical mystery or any history topic you want to see covered in the comments. Sometime around 1173, a man crossed back into Spain carrying a small Hebrew book. It described the world from the river Ebro to the edge of China, and the tales seemed fantastical. There were golden thrones, a sect of mountain assassins, a prince descended from King David, and an army of Jewish warriors hidden in the Arabian desert. Then the man vanished, and the oldest copies of his book open with a stranger's voice announcing that he's already dead and not to bother looking for him. This is the narrative of a medieval Jewish traveler named Benjamin of Tudela, who some believed was one of the most prolific travelers of the medieval period. He was called Benjamin, son of Jonah, and he came from a town on the Ebro in the small kingdom of Navarre. That's everything any document tells us about the man himself, and all of it comes from the preface of his own book. Tudela sat right on the frontier in the struggle for Iberia. It had been Muslim ground since the 8th century until Alfonso the Battler took it in 1119, roughly a decade before Benjamin was likely born. In his lifetime, it was still home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. and a boy raised there would have grown up hearing Arabic in the market and Latin in the courts while praying in Hebrew. Later tradition calls him Rabbi Benjamin, but there's no reliable evidence he ever held the title. We don't know his trade or his profession, but all evidence suggests that he wasn't actually a rabbi. The book lingers on coral, gemstones, dyeing, and silk, with the eye of a man who priced such things for a living, which has led many historians to peg him as a merchant. We also don't know why he left on his journey, since his own work is virtually free from intentional autobiographical inserts. He set out somewhere in the 1160s, most estimates landing around 1165, and the journey may have started as a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or it may have been business. Or it may have been something more deliberate, because these were bad years to be Jewish in Iberia. The Almohads were persecuting Jewish communities across Muslim Spain, and the massacres that accompanied the Crusades were within living memory. Some scholars read the book as a survey of safe harbors, a map of where a fleeing Iberian Jewish community could run if things got too hot at home. Whatever the motive, the method was unlike anything else in medieval literature. At every stop, Benjamin recorded the distance traveled, the number of Jews living there, and the names of their leading men amongst the Jewish community. He was effectively taking a census of the vast and scattered Jewish community, one town at a time. The route out of Iberia was unhurried, and from Tudela he went to Zaragoza, down the Ebro, through Tarragona and Barcelona. He then went north through Narbonne, Montpellier, and Lunel, towns dense with religious academies whose scholars he lists by name. From Marseille he sailed for Italy, skipping over the German portion of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't yet a major center of Jewish life. The counting never stopped as the journey went on, and the numbers are strangely moving in their precision. Genoa held exactly 2 Jews, brothers from Ceuta, a city in North Africa that was then located in Morocco. On the whole island of Corfu he found 1 Jew, a man named Joseph, who had been living amongst the locals for years. Rome had 200, and one of them, a young scholar named Jekyll, managed the personal household of Pope Alexander III. In Rome he was shown 2 bronze columns in the Lateran Church, said to have been carried off from Solomon's temple. In the Greek city of Thebes he counted 2,000 Jews, the finest silk workers in Greece. Constantinople, for its part, stopped him cold, and his description reads like something from another world. He'd seen Rome, but the capital of Emperor Manuel Komnenos was something else. A city he reckoned had no equal on earth except perhaps Baghdad. Baghdad was, at that point, one of the largest cities in the world, and it wouldn't be razed by the Mongols for nearly 100 years after. He describes the Church of Hagia Sophia, with its uncountable lamps and artifacts, and commented in awe that he'd never seen any building like it in the world. The Hippodrome also drew significant attention from Benjamin, who noted where every Christmas the emperor staged spectacles, including fights between lions and bears. He claims the city's income from rents, markets, and harbor tolls ran to 20,000 gold pieces a year, and that its people dressed in silk and rode about like princes. Then comes the flip side, delivered somewhat more flatly, because it wasn't all praise for the city and the society that built it. He noted that the empire's soldiers were hired foreigners, and he claimed that this was because the Greeks themselves had lost their appetite for fighting. He noted that Jews weren't allowed to live in this golden city at all, but that there still was a significant community in the area. As usual, he listed prominent members of the Jewish community in the region, and the most prominent was Solomon, one of the emperor's personal physicians. Notably, Solomon was the only Jew in the entire region that was permitted to both live within the city and also ride a horse. Crossing into Syria, he passed the territory of a sect he calls the Hashishin, mountain people who obeyed their elder in the fortress of Al-Qadmus. He said that they would carry out orders to assassinate kings at the cost of their own lives, and all their neighbors lived in fear of them. This is one of the earliest European notices of the assassins, written a full century before Marco Polo made their legend famous. Jerusalem, the presumed goal of the whole journey, gets a curiously compact entry. Under Crusader rule, it was a small, triple-walled city, crowded with Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Georgians, and Franks. Depending on which manuscript you trust, its Jewish population was either about 200 or just 4, clustered in a corner beneath the Tower of David. He counted 400 knights riding out of the hospital and 300 more quartered in what he calls Solomon's Palace, the headquarters of the Templars. Here Benjamin tells his strangest story of the entire journey. 15 years earlier, he says, 2 laborers repairing a church on Mount Zion lifted a stone and broke into a cavern. He said they found a hall of marble pillars, a golden table, a scepter, and a crown. The tombs, they believed, of David and Solomon. Before they could touch anything, a violent gust threw them to the ground, and a voice ordered them out. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem had then ordered the place to be sealed forever. Benjamin heard the tale directly from a pious Jewish ascetic named Abraham, who claimed to have been consulted at the time, and he passes it along without a word of doubt. Damascus, seat of Nur al-Din, the ruler of Syria, held 3,000 Jews in a mosque containing a glass wall that told the hours by sunlight. He also noted that the people of Damascus had recently found a portion of a giant's rib cage, which he claimed was the equivalent of 15 feet long. As for what that giant's rib cage fragment actually was, no one knows, and no other source talks about it. Further east, he passed through Mosul, home to 7,000 Jews by his count, and looked across the Tigris at the ruins of Nineveh. Historians rank this as among the earliest accurate descriptions of the site after it fell into ruin in 612 BC. But the heart of the book is Baghdad, both because it was arguably the greatest city in the world at the time, and because it had the largest Jewish community. Benjamin painted the Caliph, identified by some scholars as El-Mustanid, as something close to a saint. He read and wrote Hebrew, left his palace only once a year, and wore a black shawl over his jeweled turban as a reminder that all glory ends in darkness. His brothers lived in luxury inside the palace grounds, but they were effectively his prisoners, since they once plotted a coup against the Caliph. He funded a hospital complex where his doctors treated the sick at his expense, and an asylum where the insane were restrained and fed. Benjamin noted that once their insanity passed, the Caliph gave these people money to compensate them for the time they missed from work, which sounds remarkably modern. Baghdad held 40,000 Jews by his count, with 10 academies and 28 synagogues, and Benjamin noted that it was unlike anything else he had seen in the world. Above them all stood the exilarch, Daniel ben Hizdai, called the head of the captivity, who carried a written pedigree tracing his line back to King David. Benjamin noted that the exilarch had extraordinary power in the Jewish community, unlike anything that Jews had in Europe. He had the power to excommunicate anyone from the Jewish community, and he also had the authority to levy taxes on the Jewish community throughout Mesopotamia. This figure was so revered at the time that some Jewish groups still include prayers for the exilarch of Baghdad in their services, even though the Mongols destroyed the lineage. Past Baghdad, the book grows stranger, and there's significant disputes about where Benjamin actually visited beyond that city. He describes the ruins of Babylon, where people feared to walk among the serpents and scorpions in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. He also describes a shrine of the prophet Ezekiel, where a lamp had supposedly burned without interruption, since Ezekiel lit it himself. He tells of David Alroy, a charismatic Jewish leader from Amadia, whose followers hailed him as the Messiah. Alroy plotted rebellion against the king of Persia until he was reportedly slain in his sleep by his own father-in-law. He describes the Turkic nomads who had shattered Persia's army, a people he'd heard ate only raw meat and worshipped the wind. He claimed these people still slept in tent-like structures and refused to dwell in walled cities. In Arabia, he places the Jews of Tama and Khaybar, independent warrior tribes, hundreds of thousands strong, who owed allegiance to no king. He says that they maintained fortified compounds and would raid rival tribes, living a lifestyle that centered around access to oases. Historians are fairly certain he didn't actually travel to Arabia, because this report was wildly out of date, with both of these tribes having disappeared hundreds of years prior. In the seas toward China, which he calls Xin, stranded sailors supposedly escaped death by wrapping themselves in ox hides so that griffins would carry them to land. His is among the earliest surviving European texts to mention China by name. All told, the book covers some 300 towns and cities, plus regions he only heard about, Tibet and Ethiopia among them. Most scholars believe his first-hand travel ended around Baghdad and the Persian Gulf, and that everything beyond is the record of a tireless interviewer. Even his Egypt account has a puzzle. He walked through it in the exact years Saladin was seizing power there, and the book never once mentions his name. This is unusual because he always let his audience know who the leading members of society were wherever he traveled, suggesting his Egypt account may be a second-hand report. As for what happened to Benjamin after his incredible journey, this too is another medieval historical mystery. The preface says he came home to Iberia in 1173 and states that wherever his reports could be tested, they would prove accurate. It also speaks of him as already resting in paradise, and he's said to have died soon after his return, though no surviving document tells when, where, or how. No copy in his own hand survives, and the earliest evidence anyone had actually read the book dates from the 14th century. The oldest complete manuscript, now in London, may be from the 13th century. His travels first came to the attention of non-Jewish scholars during the Renaissance, where his work was compared to that of Marco Polo. Ultimately, we don't truly know who Benjamin of Tudela was, or why he decided to travel, only that he left behind a vivid account of the medieval world in the late 12th century. There's a hole in the record of one of the most famous kings England ever produced. It isn't a battle that's been lost from the historical record or a missing treaty with uncertain terms. It's smaller than that, and in its own unique way, far stranger. Richard the Lionheart wore the crown of England for 10 years, a brief time in which he transformed himself into one of the most widely acclaimed kings in English history. Chroniclers trailed him from Westminster to the walls of Acre, writing down his jokes, his rages, his songs, and his deathbed words. And nowhere, in any surviving page, did a single one of them record him speaking a word of English. The question is whether that silence means what everybody assumes it means. Start with a fact that tends to surprise people. Richard was actually born in England, not in France. He came into the world on September 8th, 1157, probably at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. The woman who fed him as an infant, his wet nurse, was English-born, and unlike most other women who held this position, we actually know some things about her. Her name was Hodierna, a woman from St. Albans whose own son, the future scholar Alexander Neckham, was reportedly born the same night as the prince. That coincidence of timing seems to be why she was chosen, and the two boys were nursed together in the royal household, which made a commoner's son the milk brother of a future king. Richard never forgot her, and once he took the throne, he granted Hodierna an extremely generous pension charged on royal lands. This was a serious income for a wet nurse, and she was reportedly still collecting money from the crown well into his brother John's reign. A parish in Wiltshire in West Kinnoil was known for centuries as Kinnoil Hodiern because she held land there. It's one of those small details that survives when so much else doesn't, and it tells us something interesting. Whatever Richard became, his earliest world was an English one, full of English-speaking servants, in an English town. John Gillingham, the renowned historian who has done more than anyone to strip the myths off Richard, makes the point that the boy probably spent much of his childhood in England. While his father ranged across an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, Richard likely stayed put. So if you want to argue that Richard never heard English in his formative years, the evidence is against you. But the real question is what happened next. To understand why this question of whether Richard spoke English exists at all, we have to go back to 1066. When William the Conqueror took England, he replaced its ruling class almost entirely, and the new aristocracy spoke Norman French. William himself apparently felt the awkwardness of ruling people he couldn't understand. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis tells us the conqueror tried to learn English in his 40s, so he could hear the complaints of his subjects without an interpreter. However, he found he couldn't spare the time, and ultimately gave up trying to understand the language. For more than a century after that, the language of the English court was French, the language of its records was Latin, and English itself belonged to the common people. Richard's own father is a useful measure of what royal education looked like. The courtier Walter Map claimed that Henry II had some grasp of every language spoken between England and the River Jordan, but that in conversation, he only ever used Latin and French. Notice what's missing from that daily rotation. The King of England wasn't actively speaking English. Even a king praised for his learning, a king born on the continent but who spent far more time in England than his son ever would, apparently didn't bother speaking English out loud. That's the world Richard grew up in, and nobody expected a King of England to actually speak English, any more than anyone expected him to plow a field. It simply wasn't a royal skill, and that aside, a King of England had numerous trusted retainers who were fully fluent in French, English, and Latin. Whatever English soaked into Richard in the nursery, his life pulled him away from it early. He was his mother's heir, not primarily his father's, and in 1172, at 14, he was formally installed as Duke of Aquitaine in ceremonies at Poitiers and Limoges. From then on, his world revolved around the south of France for considerable portions of his life. Aquitaine was French-speaking only in the loosest sense, because much of it didn't use the French of Paris at all. This was the land of the Languedoc, the language of the troubadours, and Richard had the movement in his blood. His great-grandfather, Duke William IX of Aquitaine, is remembered as the first troubadour whose songs survive. Richard carried on the family tradition, and 2 of his own compositions have come down to us. He wrote a taunting piece aimed at the Dauphin of Auvergne, and a more famous one he wrote as a prisoner in Germany around 1193. The latter composition is a bitter complaint that his people were taking their time raising his massive ransom. That prison song survives in Old French, with a version in Occitan as well. So we know which languages Richard demonstrably used. He spoke the French of northern France, the tongue of his administration and his court. He knew the Occitan South well enough to trade verses with its poets, which indicates a high degree of fluency. According to Gerald of Wales, Richard was apparently comfortable enough in Latin to crack a joke at the expense of an Archbishop of Canterbury due to an error in the latter's Latin grammar. Notably, English appears nowhere on that list, but then nobody was actually keeping a list, and we of course only have snippets of Richard's life. Richard was crowned at Westminster on September 3rd, 1189, and what followed has defined his reputation ever since. He'd taken the cross, he needed money to fund his excursion, and England was the richest thing he owned. He sold offices, castles, lordships, and sheriffdoms to anyone with silver. Perhaps most shockingly, he released the King of Scotland from feudal obligations his father had extracted for 10,000 marks. Richard of Devizes, a monk at Winchester with a sharp pen and a taste for gossip, wrote that the king joked he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Then he left England on his way to the Holy Land, and add up his time on English soil as king, and you get roughly 6 months out of a 10-year reign. There were about 4 months around his coronation in 1189, and about 2 more in the spring of 1194, after his release from captivity. There he wore the crown a second time at Winchester that April, but the captivity itself came with a staggering bill. The Holy Roman Emperor demanded 150,000 marks for his freedom, around 2 or 3 times the crown's annual revenue. The country was taxed so hard that the crown even leaned on churches to contribute to the ransom, a highly unusual move viewed as extremely offensive at the time. His queen Berengaria of Navarre reportedly never set foot in England at all during his lifetime. For most of his English subjects, Richard was effectively a foreign ruler with a massive tax bill attached, an interesting fact given his popular reputation. And here's a detail that shows just how far the ruling class stood from the ruled. When Richard sailed east, the man he left running England was his chancellor, William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely. Longchamp's regime collapsed in 1191, and in October he tried to slip out of the country through Dover disguised as a woman, carrying cloth as if he had something to sell. The story goes that locals on the beach spoke to him, and he couldn't answer, because after years of governing England, Longchamp didn't know a word of English. This isn't just a funny anecdote. It also provides further indication as to how Richard viewed the importance of the English language to the governance of England. That said, we have this account from Hugh of Nonant, a rival bishop who loathed him and gleefully wrote the whole fiasco up, so the details deserve suspicion. But no one at the time seems to have found the core claim implausible, that the man ruling England in the king's name couldn't manage a word of English. The argument that Richard never spoke English is simple and cumulative. The chroniclers who knew him best, men like Roger of Howden, who actually traveled to the Holy Land with the king, never once show him using it. Ambrose, who wrote an eyewitness verse account of that adventure, composed it in Norman French, the language Richard's fighting men listened to. Every scrap of the king's recorded speech, right down to the jokes, comes to us in French and Latin. Then there's the long arc of the monarchy itself. English didn't creep back into royal mouths for generations. It took until 1362 for Parliament to be opened in English, and Henry IV, crowned in 1399, is generally counted the first king since the conquest whose mother tongue was English. His coronation may have featured the first royal address in English in more than 300 years, a full 2 centuries after Richard's death. If English was still a novelty in royal mouths 200 years later, the odds that Richard bothered with it look thin. But here's the thing. No medieval source ever says Richard couldn't speak English. The confident claim that he never spoke a word of it appears nowhere in his own century, and if anything, the medieval imagination ran the other way. An English verse chronicle from the 1330s, Robert Manning's reworking of an older history, cheerfully puts a little English in Richard's mouth during his conquest of Cyprus. It's far too late to count as evidence, but it tells you medieval readers found nothing absurd about a lion-hearted king who spoke their language. It may have actually been one of the reasons why King Richard had become such a popular ruler, that the common people believed he could converse in their tongue. The certainty that he didn't speak English is a modern deduction, an argument from silence that hardened into fact through repetition. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, published in 1819, fixed the image of a French-hearted absentee king in a country still bitterly divided between Norman and Saxon. Gillingham and others have pointed out that the division Scott dramatized was already fading by Richard's day. He noted that a royal treasury official writing in the 1170s observed that Normans and English had intermarried so thoroughly that among free men you could hardly tell who was who. Now weigh the actual evidence. Richard was born in England and nursed by a woman from St. Albans. As far as the records show, he didn't even cross to the continent until May 1165, when he was 7 years old. He passed his early years in a household whose servants and grooms spoke English around him every day. Toddlers absorb the language of the people who raise them, whatever the official tongue of their parents happens to be. It's entirely plausible Richard understood some everyday English all his life, even if he never had reason to speak it anywhere a chronicler would bother recording. And consider the silence from the other direction. When a powerful man's ignorance of English was worth mocking, chroniclers mocked it. Hugh of Nonant thought Longchamp's helplessness at Dover was delicious and wrote it down for posterity. Richard had enemies too, and the court of Philip of France spread plenty of poison about him. After Conrad of Montferrat was cut down in Tyre in 1192, the French court spread the claim that Richard was behind it and that Philip was next on the list. Yet nobody ever jeered that the king couldn't speak to his own people, and maybe that's because no one expected him to, or maybe the jibe was never available to make. Personally, based upon the evidence, I suspect that Richard spoke English at a fairly rudimentary level from his early years in England. He stayed there until he was 7, which is old enough that he would have retained some of this knowledge into adulthood, regardless of what came next. Still, despite that, whether he had any real fluency in the English language is ultimately an open historical question, and one that we will likely never answer with any degree of certainty.